Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're diving into something that'll make you grateful for modern medicine. We're talking about why it absolutely sucked to be a doctor in ancient Rome. And I mean really, truly sucked in ways that would make your worst day at work look like a vacation. Now before we get started, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see our global community come together over these historical deep dives. And if you enjoy content like this, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, we've got some wild historical journeys ahead. But here's the thing, when most people think about ancient Rome, they picture gladiators, marble columns, maybe Julius Caesar giving dramatic speeches. What they don't picture is the absolute nightmare that was practicing medicine in a world where your patients might die from what we'd consider a paper cut today, where your medical tools looked more like torture devices, and where one wrong diagnosis could literally get you crucified. See, being a doctor in ancient Rome wasn't just challenging, it was a death sentence waiting to happen. For your patients, sure, but often for you too. We're talking about an era where the leading medical theory involved balancing 4 bodily fluids, where surgery was performed without anesthesia, and where the average life expectancy was about as long as a modern college degree. Tonight, I'm going to walk you through exactly why no sane person would want to be a Roman physician. We'll explore the daily horrors they faced, the impossible decisions they had to make, and the brutal reality of practicing medicine in a world that was equal parts fascinating and absolutely terrifying. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll never complain about waiting in a doctor's office again. But first, let me paint you a picture of what we're dealing with here. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that today someone is going to come to you with a problem you can't solve. Not won't solve. Can't solve because the tools, the knowledge, the basic understanding of how the human body works, they just don't exist yet. You're working with theories that are fundamentally wrong, equipment that would make a medieval blacksmith cringe, and patient expectations that are completely unrealistic. Now imagine that if you fail to cure someone, especially someone important, you might find yourself facing charges of murder, or worse, you might discover that your patient's family has some very creative ideas about revenge. This wasn't a world with malpractice insurance, folks. This was a world where medical mistakes could get you fed to lions. And here's the kicker, the thing that really made being a Roman doctor a special kind of hell. You weren't just fighting disease and injury. You were fighting superstition, politics, social prejudice, and an entire medical establishment that was built on foundations of pure guesswork. You were trying to heal people in a society that believed illness was often a punishment from the gods, where your competitors might literally be witch doctors, and where your own government might decide that your foreign medical techniques were a threat to Roman values. But it gets worse. So much worse. Let's start with your typical day as a Roman physician. You wake up before dawn, not because you're particularly ambitious, but because you know that by the time the sun rises, there's going to be a line of desperate people outside your door. And I mean desperate. We're talking about people with conditions that would be easily treatable today, but were basically death sentences back then. Your first patient of the day hobbles in with what's clearly a severe infection. Maybe it started as a small cut, maybe a splinter, doesn't matter. What matters is that without antibiotics, this person is probably going to die, and everyone expects you to save them. You've got a few options here, none of them good. You can try bloodletting, which might actually make things worse. You can apply some herbal remedies that might help, but probably won't. Or you can attempt surgery with tools that haven't been properly sterilized because germ theory won't be discovered for another 1,000 years. And here's the thing that really gets me. You probably know deep down that what you're doing isn't going to work. Roman physicians weren't stupid. They could see patterns. They knew that certain treatments failed more often than they succeeded. But they were trapped in a system of medical theory that demanded they keep trying the same ineffective approaches over and over again. Your second patient comes in with what we'd recognize today as appendicitis. Severe abdominal pain, fever, the whole 9 yards. In our world, this is a routine surgery. Laparoscopic appendectomy, couple days in the hospital, back to normal life. In ancient Rome, this person is going to die. Period. And not only are they going to die, they're going to die in agony because pain management consists of maybe some wine and possibly some opium if you're lucky enough to have access to it. But wait, there's more, because you can't just say, sorry, this person is going to die, there's nothing I can do. That's not how Roman society worked. People expected results, they expected miracles, and if you couldn't deliver miracles, well, maybe you weren't really a doctor at all. Maybe you were a fraud, a charlatan, someone who deserved to be exposed and punished. So you do what you can. You prescribe bed rest, maybe some dietary changes, definitely some prayers to the appropriate gods. You charge a fee because you've got to eat too, and then you wait. Sometimes the person gets better on their own, and you get credit for a miraculous cure. More often they die, and you get blamed for their death. Now multiply this scenario by every single patient you see, every single day. Broken bones that you can't properly set. Diseases you can't identify, let alone cure. Infections that spread faster than you can treat them. Women dying in childbirth because you don't understand basic hygiene. Children succumbing to illnesses that would be prevented by simple vaccinations in our world. And through it all, you're supposed to maintain this image of competence and authority. You're supposed to project confidence even when you have no idea what you're doing. Because the moment people lose faith in your abilities, you're finished. Not just professionally finished, potentially literally finished. But here's where it gets really interesting, and by interesting, I mean horrifying. Roman medicine wasn't just about treating sick people, it was about navigating an incredibly complex social and political landscape where your medical opinions could get you in serious trouble. Let's say you're treating a wealthy Roman senator. This guy has all the classic symptoms of what we'd recognize as heart disease. High blood pressure, chest pains, probably brought on by a lifestyle of rich food and minimal exercise. Now you could tell him the truth. You could explain that he needs to change his diet, get more exercise, maybe lose some weight. But here's the problem. Telling a powerful Roman that his lifestyle is killing him isn't just medical advice. It's social commentary. It's political criticism. It's essentially saying that the Roman way of life, the very foundation of their civilization, is unhealthy. So what do? Do you give honest medical advice and risk offending someone who could have you exiled or executed? Or do you play it safe, blame his condition on an imbalance of humors, prescribe some harmless remedies, and hope for the best? Most Roman doctors chose option 2, not because they were cowards, but because they were pragmatists. They understood that their survival depended not just on their medical skills, but on their political awareness. They had to be doctors, yes, but they also had to be diplomats, psychologists, and sometimes even entertainers. And speaking of entertainment, let's talk about one of the most bizarre aspects of Roman medicine: the public nature of it all. This wasn't a world where patient privacy existed. When you were treating someone, especially someone important, it was often a public spectacle. Family members, friends, political allies, sometimes even random spectators would gather around to watch you work. Imagine trying to perform surgery while a crowd of people critique your every move. Imagine trying to diagnose a condition while the patient's relatives offer their own theories about what's wrong. Imagine trying to maintain sterile conditions when you've got dozens of unwashed people breathing down your neck. But it gets worse, because those spectators weren't just passive observers. They were judges. They were evaluating your performance, deciding whether you were competent or incompetent, trustworthy or fraudulent, and their opinions mattered. Word of mouth was everything in Roman society. One bad review from the wrong person could destroy your career overnight. And then there were the gladiators. Oh, the gladiators. If you were unlucky enough to be assigned as a physician to the games, you were basically signing up for a front row seat to human butchery. These weren't athletes getting treated for sports injuries. These were people who had been deliberately mutilated for entertainment, and you were expected to patch them up so they could go back out and get mutilated again. The trauma that Roman doctors must have experienced day after day, watching people suffer and die while being powerless to really help them, it's almost unimaginable. And unlike modern physicians, they didn't have support systems, no therapy, no peer counseling, no professional organizations to help them cope with the psychological burden of their work. They just had to endure it, day after day, year after year, watching the worst of human suffering and pretending they had the power to fix it. But perhaps the most frustrating aspect of being a Roman doctor was the complete lack of scientific method. Everything was based on tradition, superstition, and the writings of ancient authorities who were often completely wrong. You couldn't question established medical doctrine without being accused of arrogance or heresy. You couldn't experiment with new treatments without risking accusations of practicing harmful magic. You were trapped in a system that prioritized authority over evidence, tradition over innovation, and social conformity over medical progress. And if you tried to break free from that system, if you tried to actually advance the field of medicine, you'd quickly find yourself on the wrong side of both the medical establishment and Roman society as a whole. The tools of the trade weren't much help either. Roman surgical instruments looked like they belonged in a torture chamber, and honestly, they might as well have been torture devices. Crude bronze knives, primitive bone saws, forceps that were basically fancy pliers. No magnification, no precision instruments, no way to see what you were actually doing once you cut someone open. And let's not forget about anesthesia, or rather the complete lack thereof. Every surgical procedure was performed on fully conscious patients who were simply held down by assistants while you did your work. The screaming alone must have been enough to drive physicians to madness. Pain management consisted of alcohol, opium if you were lucky, and maybe some herbal concoctions that might have had mild analgesic properties. But mostly, people just had to endure whatever you were doing to them. And you had to endure their suffering while trying to maintain steady hands and clear thinking. The mortality rates were astronomical. Even minor procedures carried significant risk of death from infection, blood loss, or simple shock. Major surgeries were essentially death sentences that patients sometimes survived by accident rather than design. And every death was a mark against your reputation, a reminder of your limitations, a source of guilt and professional anxiety. But here's what really made the whole situation a nightmare: the competition. You weren't just competing with other trained physicians. You were competing with priests, soothsayers, traveling miracle workers, and anyone else who claimed they could heal the sick. And guess what? Sometimes their completely unscientific methods actually worked better than yours, purely by chance. Picture this scenario. You spend weeks treating a wealthy merchant's daughter using proper Roman medical theory. Bloodletting to balance her humors, special diets, expensive imported herbs. She gets worse. Then some traveling mystic shows up, waves some incense around, chants a few prayers, and boom, the girl recovers. Who gets the credit? Who gets paid? Who gets recommended to all the merchant's wealthy friends? It wasn't the doctor who actually understood anatomy and had years of training. It was the guy with the better showmanship. This is where Roman medicine got really twisted. Success wasn't measured by medical knowledge or even patient outcomes. It was measured by reputation, connections, and your ability to put on a convincing performance. The best Roman doctors weren't necessarily the most skilled healers. They were the most charismatic entertainers. You had to master the art of looking confident while having no idea what you were doing. You had to speak with authority about subjects you barely understood. You had to make dramatic pronouncements about complex conditions while secretly hoping you weren't about to kill someone with your ignorance. And the pressure was constant. Every diagnosis was a public declaration of your expertise. Every treatment was a test of your reputation. Every patient was an opportunity to either enhance your career or destroy it completely. There was no middle ground, no room for honest uncertainty, no acceptable way to say, "I don't know." Let's talk about the social dynamics for a moment, because they were absolutely brutal. Roman society was incredibly stratified, and as a doctor, you occupied this weird middle position that nobody quite knew how to handle. You weren't nobility, but you served nobility. You weren't a slave, but you were dependent on the whims of people who could crush you without consequence. If you were treating a senator's wife and she died, you didn't just lose a patient. You potentially made a powerful enemy who could have you banned from practicing medicine, exiled from Rome, or worse. But if you refused to treat important patients because the risk was too high, word would spread that you were a coward and your career would be over anyway. The wealthy patients were demanding and entitled, expecting miracles and throwing tantrums when reality didn't meet their expectations. The poor patients were desperate and often couldn't pay, but refusing to treat them would damage your reputation for compassion. And the middle-class patients were the worst of both worlds, demanding but not wealthy enough to make the headaches worthwhile. Then there was the gender issue. Roman society had very specific ideas about what kinds of medical care were appropriate for women, and as a male physician, you were constantly walking through a minefield of social taboos and cultural restrictions. You couldn't examine female patients properly without causing scandal, but you were still expected to cure their ailments through guesswork and prayer. Female physicians existed, but they faced their own unique set of challenges. They were often dismissed as midwives or herbalists rather than real doctors, regardless of their actual training or expertise. They had to work twice as hard to gain half the respect that male physicians received automatically. And speaking of training, let's discuss just how inadequate Roman medical education really was. There were no medical schools in the modern sense, no standardized curriculum, no licensing exams, no oversight of any kind. You basically learned by watching other doctors work and hoping they knew what they were doing. Most medical knowledge was passed down through apprenticeships, which meant that errors and misconceptions were perpetuated for generations. If your mentor believed that left-handed people were inherently sickly, congratulations. You now believe that too. If he thought that women's wombs could wander around their bodies causing hysteria, well, that was now part of your medical expertise. The few medical texts that existed were often contradictory, written in different languages, and based on completely different theoretical frameworks. Greek medicine emphasized the four humors. Egyptian medicine focused on spiritual causes. Local folk traditions added their own layers of confusion. You were supposed to somehow synthesize all of this into a coherent practice while treating patients who expected definitive answers. But here's the really insidious part. Roman doctors were expected to be experts on everything, not just medicine, but philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, literature. You were supposed to be a Renaissance man centuries before the Renaissance actually happened. Patients wanted doctors who could discuss poetry while setting bones, who could quote philosophers while treating infections. This meant that instead of focusing intensively on medical knowledge, you had to spread your intellectual energy across dozens of different subjects. You became a jack of all trades and master of none, which is exactly the opposite of what you want in someone who's supposed to save your life. The economic realities were just as harsh as everything else. Roman medicine operated on a fee-for-service model, but collecting payment was often more challenging than treating the actual diseases. Wealthy patients might stiff you if they weren't completely satisfied with their outcomes. Poor patients couldn't pay at all, and middle-class patients would haggle over every sestertius while demanding royal treatment. You couldn't exactly repossess someone's health if they didn't pay their medical bills. You couldn't sue for malpractice if a patient died, but patients' families could definitely sue you for incompetence or fraud. The legal system was heavily biased in favor of wealthy plaintiffs, which meant that one disgruntled aristocrat could tie you up in court for years. Many Roman doctors supplemented their income by selling medicines, but this created its own problems. You were incentivized to prescribe expensive treatments whether patients needed them or not. You had to maintain inventory of herbs and compounds that might spoil before you could sell them. And you were competing with every apothecary, herbalist, and snake oil salesman in the city. The really successful Roman doctors weren't the ones who were best at healing people. They were the ones who were best at managing wealthy patrons, networking with influential families, and building their personal brands. Medicine became secondary to marketing, which is probably why so many Roman medical practices were completely ineffective. But let's get back to the daily grind, because that's where the real horror lived. Every morning brought a new parade of human suffering that you were powerless to meaningfully address. Broken bones that would never heal properly. Infections that would spread until they killed. Cancers that would eat people alive while you watched helplessly. And you couldn't just be honest about your limitations. You couldn't say, this person is going to die and there's nothing anyone can do about it. You had to maintain hope, project confidence, keep families believing that your interventions might make a difference. You had to lie professionally, constantly to people who were trusting you with their lives. The psychological toll must have been enormous. Imagine spending your entire career knowing that most of your patients would be better off if they just stayed home and prayed instead of seeking your help. Imagine watching people suffer through treatments that you knew were useless but couldn't admit were useless because your entire livelihood depended on people believing in your expertise. Roman doctors developed elaborate rationalization systems to cope with their constant failures. When treatments didn't work, it was because the patient hadn't followed instructions properly, or because the gods had decided their fate, or because some other factor beyond the doctor's control had interfered. Never because the treatment itself was fundamentally flawed. This created a medical culture of denial and self-deception that made it almost impossible to learn from mistakes or improve practices. Every failure was explained away rather than analyzed. Every success was attributed to the doctor's skill rather than random chance. Progress was virtually impossible under these conditions. And then there were the plagues. Oh, the plagues. When epidemic diseases swept through Roman cities, doctors were expected to be on the front lines, treating patients who were almost certainly going to die while exposing themselves to deadly infections in the process. No protective equipment, no understanding of disease transmission, no effective treatments. During plague years, being a doctor was essentially a suicide mission with extra steps. You'd watch your colleagues die one by one as they tried to treat patients with diseases they couldn't identify, let alone cure. You'd see entire neighborhoods wiped out while feeling completely helpless to stop the carnage. But you couldn't just flee the city like everyone else with sense and money. Your professional reputation depended on staying and fighting the hopeless fight. Abandoning your patients during a crisis would mark you as a coward and end your career permanently. So you stayed, and you watched, and you waited for your turn to become another casualty. The stress of Roman medical practice created its own health problems for doctors. Chronic anxiety, depression, alcoholism, and what we now recognize as PTSD were probably endemic among physicians. But there was no mental health support, no understanding of psychological trauma, no socially acceptable way to acknowledge that the work was destroying you from the inside. You were supposed to be strong, confident, unflappable. You were supposed to face death and suffering with stoic composure. Showing weakness or vulnerability would undermine patients' confidence in your abilities and damage your professional standing. So you suffered in silence while projecting an image of calm competence. The isolation was crushing. You couldn't discuss your failures with colleagues because that would be admitting incompetence. You couldn't share your doubts with patients because that would destroy their hope. You couldn't confide in friends and family because they wouldn't understand the unique pressures of medical practice. Roman doctors lived in a world of professional loneliness, surrounded by people but unable to be honest with any of them about the reality of their work. They were trapped in a role that demanded perfection while providing them with tools that guaranteed failure. And if all of that wasn't enough to convince you that being a Roman doctor was a nightmare, let's talk about the legal system, because in ancient Rome, medical practice wasn't just dangerous for your patients, it was legally dangerous for you. Roman law had this fascinating concept called the Aquilian law, which basically meant that if you killed someone through negligence or incompetence, you could be held financially responsible for their entire economic value, not just medical malpractice as we understand it today. We're talking about having to compensate a family for the total lifetime earnings of the person you failed to save. Now imagine you're treating a young aristocrat who dies under your care. Maybe it was appendicitis, maybe it was infection, maybe it was just bad luck. Doesn't matter. His family can now sue you for what that young man would have earned over the next 40 years if he'd lived. We're talking about financial ruin that could destroy not just you, but your entire family for generations. But here's the really twisted part. The same law didn't apply if you were treating slaves. Kill a slave through medical incompetence, and you only owed the owner the replacement cost. So Roman doctors were incentivized to practice on slaves and poor people, where the legal consequences were minimal rather than developing their skills on cases where they might actually be held accountable for failure. This created a horrifying two-tier medical system where the wealthy got doctors who were terrified of making mistakes, while the poor got doctors who were essentially using them as practice dummies. And since most medical knowledge came from trial and error, this meant that the people who could least afford good medical care were the ones bearing the risks of medical experimentation. Let's dig deeper into the day-to-day reality of what this meant. You wake up, and before you've even had breakfast, you have to make a choice that could destroy your life. A messenger arrives at your door, there's been an accident, a senator's son has fallen from his horse and is unconscious. The family is demanding the best medical care available. Now, head injuries were essentially untreatable in Roman times. Modern neurosurgery wouldn't exist for another 2,000 years. You know with near certainty that this young man is probably going to die regardless of what you do. But you also know that if you refuse to treat him, word will spread that you're a coward who only takes easy cases. Your reputation will be ruined. So you go. You arrive at this magnificent villa where dozens of important people are gathered, all watching your every move. The patient is clearly dying. His pupils are unresponsive, His breathing is irregular. He's showing all the signs of severe brain trauma. In our world, he'd be rushed to a hospital for emergency neurosurgery that might save his life. In ancient Rome, he's a dead man walking, but you can't say that. You can't tell a room full of powerful Romans that their beloved son is beyond help. So you start performing whatever treatments Roman medical theory demands. Maybe you try trepanation, drilling holes in his skull to release evil spirits or rebalance his humors. Maybe you attempt bloodletting to reduce pressure. Maybe you prescribe exotic herbs and pray to the appropriate gods. And while you're doing all of this, you're acutely aware that every person in that room is judging your competence. They're watching for signs of confidence or uncertainty. They're listening to every word you say, looking for evidence that you know what you're doing. And if this young man dies, which he almost certainly will, they're going to remember every detail of your performance when they're deciding whether to blame you for his death. The psychological pressure must have been unbearable. You're performing medical theater for an audience that has the power to destroy you, while treating a patient you know you can't save, using methods you probably suspect are useless. And you have to look confident and competent while doing it. But let's say, by some miracle, the young man survives. Maybe the injury wasn't as severe as it looked. Maybe he had some natural recovery that had nothing to do with your treatment. Suddenly, you're a hero. Word spreads that you saved a senator's son from certain death. Your reputation soars. Wealthy patients start seeking you out specifically because of your miraculous skills. And now you're trapped in a different kind of nightmare because you know that your success had nothing to do with your medical abilities. You know that the next similar case you encounter will probably end in death, and then everyone will wonder what happened to your magical healing powers. You've become a victim of your own accidental success. This is the cruel randomness that defined Roman medical practice. Your reputation wasn't based on your actual skills or knowledge. It was based on the random outcomes of cases that were mostly beyond your control. You could be the most knowledgeable, skilled, careful physician in Rome, but if you had a streak of bad luck with difficult cases, your career was over. On the flip side, you could be a complete fraud with no medical training whatsoever, but if you happened to treat several patients who recovered on their own, you'd be hailed as a master healer. The system rewarded luck and punished competence with equal enthusiasm. And speaking of frauds, let's talk about the competition you were facing. Roman medicine attracted every kind of charlatan, quack, and confidence artist you can imagine. People who claimed they could cure cancer with magical crystals. Traveling healers who sold miracle potions that were basically colored water. Religious fanatics who insisted that all diseases could be cured through proper prayer and sacrifice. These people didn't have to worry about actual medical knowledge because they weren't really practicing medicine. They were practicing entertainment. They put on elaborate shows, made dramatic pronouncements, and took credit when patients occasionally got better on their own. And because their methods were so different from established Roman medical practice, they couldn't be easily disproven. Imagine spending years learning anatomy, studying the works of ancient medical authorities, practicing surgical techniques, only to lose patients to some guy who claimed he could cure everything by aligning their chakras or whatever the Roman equivalent was. Your evidence-based approach, such as it was, couldn't compete with someone who promised magical results and had the showmanship to make people believe it. This created a perverse incentive system where legitimate doctors were pressured to become more like entertainers just to compete. You had to develop your own dramatic flair, create mystique around your treatments, make grand promises about miraculous cures. The line between medicine and performance art became increasingly blurred. But here's where it gets really dark. Roman society was incredibly superstitious, and illness was often viewed as divine punishment for moral failings. So when you failed to cure someone, it wasn't just seen as medical incompetence. It was seen as evidence that the gods disapproved of either you or your patient. If a virtuous, well-respected citizen died under your care, the implication was that you must have done something to offend the deities. Maybe you hadn't performed the proper rituals before treatment. Maybe you had treated morally questionable patients and become contaminated by their spiritual corruption. Maybe you were practicing forbidden foreign magic disguised as medicine. These weren't just social embarrassments. In a society where religious orthodoxy was enforced by the state, accusations of impiety could result in exile, imprisonment, or death. Roman doctors had to be not just medical practitioners, but also religious performers, constantly demonstrating their devotion to approved gods and their rejection of foreign spiritual influences. This meant that your medical practice was constantly under surveillance, not just by medical authorities, but by religious and political ones as well. You couldn't just focus on treating patients. You had to make sure that your treatments were socially acceptable, religiously orthodox, and politically safe. Let's talk about the tools of the trade for a moment, because Roman surgical instruments were basically medieval torture devices with delusions of medical utility. Your standard surgical kit included bronze knives that wouldn't hold an edge, bone saws that were about as precise as modern-day lumber tools, and forceps that were essentially fancy pliers. Performing surgery with these instruments was like trying to perform brain surgery with kitchen utensils. You had no magnification, no precision instruments, no way to control bleeding effectively. Every incision was a crude hack through tissue that you could barely see properly. Every attempt to extract foreign objects was a fishing expedition that usually caused more damage than the original injury. And remember, all of this was happening without any form of effective anesthesia. Your patients were fully conscious, experiencing every cut, every probe, every manipulation of their internal organs. They were held down by assistants while you worked, screaming in agony, begging you to stop, sometimes literally dying of shock from the pain alone. The psychological impact on the surgeon must have been devastating. You're trying to help people while simultaneously torturing them. You're causing immense suffering in the hope of preventing even greater suffering. And you're doing it all with tools that make precision impossible and outcomes unpredictable. But you couldn't show weakness or hesitation. Patients and their families were watching for any sign that you weren't confident in your abilities. If your hands shook, if you paused to reconsider your approach, if you showed any uncertainty about what you were doing, it would undermine their faith in your skills and potentially make them panic. So you had to maintain a facade of calm competence while performing brutal procedures on screaming patients with inadequate tools and no real understanding of what you were doing. You had to project authority while feeling completely lost. You had to appear scientific while engaging in what was essentially educated guesswork. The infection rates after surgery were astronomical. Without understanding germ theory, Roman surgeons had no concept of sterile technique. They used the same instruments on multiple patients without cleaning them properly. They operated in non-sterile environments with multiple people breathing over the surgical site. They didn't understand that the hands performing surgery needed to be clean. Post-operative care consisted mainly of keeping wounds covered and hoping for the best. There were no antibiotics to prevent infection, no IV fluids to maintain hydration, no monitoring equipment to track vital signs. Patients either healed on their own or they died, and there wasn't much you could do to influence the outcome either way. This meant that surgery was essentially a last resort that patients chose when they were desperate enough to risk almost certain death. And as the surgeon, you were asking people to trust you with procedures that you knew would probably kill them. You were taking responsibility for outcomes that were largely beyond your control. The guilt must have been overwhelming. Every patient who died on your operating table was someone who might have lived longer if they'd never sought your help. Every failed surgery was a reminder of your limitations and the fundamental inadequacy of Roman medical knowledge. But you couldn't dwell on these failures because there was always another patient waiting. Another impossible case that you were expected to solve with confidence and authority. The emotional toll of constant failure, combined with the pressure to always appear successful, must have driven many Roman doctors to despair. And then there were the political complications. Roman medicine was heavily influenced by Greek medical traditions, but Romans were deeply ambivalent about Greek culture. They admired Greek learning but resented Greek influence. They wanted the benefits of Greek medical knowledge, but didn't want to admit that Romans were inferior to Greeks in any field of study. This created a constant tension for Roman doctors who were trained in Greek methods. You had to demonstrate your medical expertise while also proving your Roman patriotism. You had to use Greek medical theories while downplaying their Greek origins. You had to navigate between scientific accuracy and political correctness. If you were too obviously influenced by Greek medicine, you might be accused of undermining Roman values. If you rejected Greek knowledge entirely, you'd be practicing inferior medicine and losing patients unnecessarily. There was no safe middle ground that satisfied both medical and political requirements. Foreign doctors faced even worse challenges. If you were Egyptian, Syrian, or from any other conquered territory, you were automatically suspected of practicing barbaric or superstitious medicine. Your techniques were viewed with suspicion regardless of their effectiveness. Your successes were attributed to luck or deception rather than skill. But at the same time, exotic foreign medicine was often in high demand among wealthy Romans, who believed that distant healing traditions might possess secret knowledge unavailable to local doctors. So you had to be foreign enough to seem mysterious and powerful, but Roman enough to avoid accusations of cultural subversion. This balancing act was impossible to maintain perfectly. You were always at risk of being denounced as either a fraud or a foreign agent, depending on which way the political winds were blowing. Your medical practice existed at the mercy of social prejudices that could change overnight based on current events or political fashions. The economic pressures were relentless as well. Roman doctors operated in a competitive marketplace where reputation was everything and failure was professionally fatal. You couldn't afford to turn down difficult cases because that would make you look incompetent or cowardly. But you couldn't afford to take on too many hopeless cases because a string of deaths would destroy your reputation. You had to constantly calculate the risk-reward ratio of every potential patient. Was this person important enough that treating them successfully would advance your career? Were they sick enough that failure could be attributed to the severity of their condition rather than your incompetence? Could their family afford to pay your fees, and would they pay even if the treatment failed? These calculations had nothing to do with medical need or your ability to help. They were pure business decisions based on protecting your professional standing and financial security. The actual welfare of patients was secondary to the political and economic implications of treating them. This system incentivized doctors to cherry-pick cases that were either easy wins or prestigious enough to be worth the risk. It discouraged innovation because experimental treatments might fail spectacularly and ruin your reputation. It punished honesty because admitting uncertainty would make patients seek out more confident competitors. Roman medical practice became an elaborate performance designed to manage public perception rather than actually heal people. Doctors became actors playing the role of healers, using whatever props and techniques would convince audiences of their competence. And the really tragic part is that some Roman doctors probably were genuinely skilled and knowledgeable within the limitations of their era, but the system they worked in made it almost impossible to distinguish between real expertise and convincing showmanship. The market rewards went to whoever could put on the most persuasive performance, regardless of their actual medical abilities. The few doctors who tried to practice honest, evidence-based medicine found themselves at a severe disadvantage. They couldn't make the dramatic promises that patients wanted to hear. They couldn't guarantee miraculous results. They had to admit uncertainty and acknowledge the limitations of their knowledge. In a marketplace where confidence was everything and failure was unforgivable, intellectual honesty was a luxury that most doctors couldn't afford. The system systematically selected for overconfidence, showmanship, and self-deception, while punishing humility, caution, and scientific skepticism. This is why Roman medicine remained stagnant for centuries despite having some genuinely brilliant physicians. The social and economic structure of medical practice made it virtually impossible for good doctors to succeed by being good doctors. They had to succeed by being good performers, which meant that actual medical progress was largely accidental. The whole system was designed to produce the appearance of medical expertise rather than actual medical expertise. And for the doctors trapped within it, this meant spending their entire careers knowing that they were failing their patients while being forced to pretend otherwise. The sleep deprivation alone would have broken most people. Roman doctors didn't get to go home at 5 o'clock and forget about their patients until the next morning. When you were responsible for someone's life, you were on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for as long as they remained under your care. Picture this. You've just finished a grueling day treating a dozen patients with conditions ranging from infected wounds to mysterious fevers. You're exhausted, your hands are stained with blood, and you're looking forward to a few hours of rest. Then a frantic servant pounds on your door at midnight. A wealthy merchant's wife has gone into labor, and there are complications. Now, childbirth in ancient Rome was essentially a death sentence lottery. About 1 in 4 women died during or shortly after delivery. Infant mortality was even worse, and as the attending physician, you were expected to save both mother and child using techniques that were more likely to kill them than help them. You drag yourself out of bed, gather your primitive instruments, and rush through the dark streets to face another impossible situation. The woman has been in labor for 18 hours. She's exhausted, bleeding, and the baby is in the wrong position. In our world, this would be an emergency cesarean section. In ancient Rome, it's a death watch with medical theater. You try everything you know. Herbal concoctions to speed labor, manual manipulation to reposition the baby, prayers to every goddess of childbirth you can remember. But deep down, you know you're probably going to lose them both. And when you do, the family won't blame the gods or bad luck. They'll blame you. So you stay awake all night, fighting a battle you can't win, knowing that failure will damage your reputation and success will be attributed to divine intervention rather than your skills. Win or lose, you're back to treating patients the next morning because the stream of human suffering never stops. This kind of sleep deprivation wasn't occasional, it was constant. Roman doctors lived in a state of chronic exhaustion that would be considered torture by modern standards. Your decision-making abilities were compromised, your hands were unsteady, your judgment was impaired. But you couldn't show weakness because patients needed to believe in your competence. The physical toll was devastating, but the emotional toll was worse. Every night you were awakened by someone's crisis. Every day brought fresh reminders of your inadequacy. Every week delivered new tragedies that you were powerless to prevent, but obligated to witness. And speaking of obligations, let's talk about the house calls. Because in ancient Rome, patients didn't come to you, you went to them. And that meant entering some of the most dangerous, unsanitary, and politically volatile environments imaginable. Wealthy patients lived in palatial villas that were breeding grounds for political intrigue. You weren't just treating their medical conditions, you were witnessing their family dramas, their business dealings, their personal secrets. Knowledge that could get you killed if you shared it with the wrong people or failed to share it with the right ones. Poor patients lived in cramped insulae, multi-story apartment buildings that were basically vertical slums. These places were fire traps, disease incubators, and crime scenes waiting to happen. You'd climb narrow staircases in complete darkness, carrying valuable medical supplies through neighborhoods where robbery and murder were routine occurrences. And then there were the truly desperate cases. Patients who lived in the Subura, Rome's most notorious slum district. Here you'd find people with conditions that defied description, diseases that modern medicine has completely eradicated, injuries that resulted from violence, neglect, and desperation, malnutrition so severe that patients looked like walking skeletons. But you couldn't refuse these cases because word would spread that you only treated the wealthy. Your reputation for compassion was just as important as your reputation for competence. So you ventured into these hellholes, knowing that you were risking your life to provide medical care that probably wouldn't work anyway. The smell alone in these places would have been overwhelming. Human waste, rotting food, infected wounds, unwashed bodies, and death. Lots of death. In the poorest areas of Rome, people died regularly from conditions that wealthy citizens would recover from easily. And you were expected to walk into this environment and somehow make a difference. Your medical bag made you a target for thieves who thought you were carrying valuable drugs or coins. Your clean clothes marked you as an outsider who didn't belong in these neighborhoods. Your very presence attracted attention from people who had nothing to lose and every reason to resent your obvious prosperity. But you couldn't hire bodyguards because that would make you look weak and cowardly. You couldn't dress down because that would undermine your professional authority. You couldn't avoid dangerous areas because that would limit your patient base. So you just accepted that practicing medicine meant regularly risking violent death for the privilege of treating people you couldn't actually help. The diagnostic process itself was a nightmare of guesswork and superstition. Without x-rays, blood tests, or any understanding of microbiology, you were essentially playing medical charades with people's lives. You had to figure out what was wrong based on external symptoms, patient descriptions, and whatever folk wisdom you'd absorbed over the years. A patient comes to you complaining of chest pain. Is it heart disease, lung infection, muscle strain, anxiety, poisoning, divine punishment for moral transgressions? You have no way of knowing, but you have to make a confident diagnosis anyway because uncertainty would destroy your credibility. So you develop elaborate systems for reading signs and portents. The color of the patient's urine becomes a window into their soul. The texture of their pulse reveals the balance of their humors. The alignment of the stars at the time of their birth influences which treatments will be effective. These diagnostic methods were completely useless from a medical standpoint, but they served an important psychological function. They gave you something to do, some framework for making decisions, some way of appearing knowledgeable and systematic in your approach. But here's the cruel irony. The more elaborate your diagnostic rituals became, the more convinced you became of their validity. You started seeing patterns that didn't exist, making connections that were pure coincidence, developing confidence in methods that were fundamentally flawed. This false confidence was dangerous because it prevented you from recognizing the limitations of your knowledge. Instead of admitting that you didn't understand what was wrong with someone, you'd confidently misdiagnose them and prescribe treatments that might make their condition worse. The treatment options were equally problematic. Roman medicine was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this theory, all illness resulted from imbalances between these bodily fluids, and treatment involved restoring proper balance through various means. Bloodletting was the go-to solution for almost everything. Patient has a fever, must be too much blood. Cut open a vein and drain some out. Patient is pale and weak, probably still too much blood, just a different kind. More bloodletting. Patient is obviously dying from blood loss? Well, clearly you haven't removed enough of the bad blood yet. This approach was not only useless, but actively harmful. You were deliberately weakening patients who were already sick, reducing their ability to fight off infections or recover from injuries. But humoral theory demanded it, and challenging established medical doctrine was professional suicide. Purging was another popular treatment. If bloodletting didn't work, maybe the problem was an excess of bile that needed to be expelled through vomiting or diarrhea. So you'd give patients powerful emetics and laxatives that would leave them dehydrated, malnourished, and even weaker than before. These treatments were based on the logical premise that removing bad substances from the body would restore health. But without understanding what those substances actually were or how the body really worked, you were just randomly removing things and hoping for improvement. The herbal remedies were slightly more promising because some plants actually do have medicinal properties. But Roman doctors had no way of standardizing dosages, identifying active compounds, or distinguishing between correlation and causation. A patient might recover after taking willow bark tea, but you wouldn't know whether the tea helped or whether they would have recovered anyway. This led to massive overprescription of herbal treatments that ranged from useless to toxic. You'd prescribe complex mixtures of dozens of different plants, hoping that something in the combination might be effective. But with no understanding of drug interactions or individual sensitivities, you were essentially conducting uncontrolled medical experiments on sick people. The placebo effect probably accounted for whatever success these treatments achieved. Patients who believed their doctor was competent and their medicine was powerful sometimes felt better regardless of what they were actually given. But this created a false feedback loop where ineffective treatments appeared to work, reinforcing bad medical practices. And then there were the surgical procedures, which were basically organized mutilation with optimistic intentions. Roman surgeons performed amputations, tumor removals, cataract extractions, and even brain surgery using bronze instruments that were barely sharper than butter knives. Imagine trying to remove a cataract from someone's eye using a bronze needle while they're fully conscious and struggling against the assistants holding them down. You're working by lamplight in a room full of people breathing over your patient. Your hands are shaking from exhaustion and stress. One wrong move could blind them permanently or kill them outright. But you can't show uncertainty or hesitation because that would panic everyone in the room. You have to proceed with confident precision while performing a procedure that would challenge modern surgeons with all their advanced tools and training. The pressure must have been absolutely crushing. The pain management consisted of getting patients drunk and hoping they'd pass out before you started cutting. Opium was available, but expensive and unreliable in quality. Most surgical patients just had to endure whatever you were doing to them while remaining conscious enough to follow instructions. The screaming alone would have been traumatic for the surgeon. You're trying to help someone while causing them agony that's beyond description. You're supposed to maintain steady hands and clear thinking while listening to another human being beg you to stop hurting them. And the worst part is that you knew most of these procedures wouldn't work. Infection rates were astronomical. Patients died from shock, blood loss, or post-operative complications more often than they survived. But you couldn't refuse to operate because that would make you look incompetent or cowardly. So you performed surgery knowing it would probably kill your patient, but hoping that the small chance of success would justify the enormous risk. You bet people's lives on procedures that were more likely to harm than help, and you had to live with the consequences when your gambles failed. The psychological defense mechanisms that Roman doctors developed to cope with this constant failure were elaborate and self-deceptive. When patients died, it was because they hadn't followed instructions properly, or because the gods had decided their fate, or because some external factor had interfered with treatment. When patients recovered, it was obviously because of the doctor's skill and wisdom. This selective attribution allowed physicians to maintain their sanity and confidence despite overwhelming evidence that their methods were ineffective. But these defense mechanisms came at a cost. They prevented doctors from learning from their mistakes, recognizing patterns of failure, or developing more effective treatments. The system was designed to protect doctors' egos rather than improve patient outcomes. Roman medical education reinforced these problems by emphasizing authority over evidence. Students learned by memorizing ancient texts and copying their teachers' techniques without questioning whether those techniques actually worked. Innovation was discouraged because it implied that established authorities had been wrong. This created a medical culture that was fundamentally anti-scientific. Observation and experimentation were less important than adherence to tradition. Questioning established doctrine was seen as arrogance rather than intellectual curiosity. Medical knowledge became increasingly rigid and divorced from reality. The few doctors who tried to challenge this system found themselves ostracized by their colleagues and rejected by patients who wanted traditional treatments. There was no institutional support for medical research, no mechanism for testing new theories, no way to systematically improve medical knowledge. Progress happened only by accident, when random changes in practice happened to produce better outcomes. But these improvements were rare and usually attributed to divine intervention rather than human innovation. The social isolation of Roman doctors was profound. You couldn't discuss your doubts with colleagues because that would be admitting incompetence. You couldn't share your failures with patients because that would destroy their confidence. You couldn't confide in friends and family because they wouldn't understand the unique pressures of medical practice. You lived in a world where everyone expected you to have answers you didn't possess, solutions you couldn't provide, and confidence you couldn't honestly feel. The psychological strain of maintaining this facade while watching people suffer and die must have been enormous. Many Roman doctors probably developed what we'd now recognize as depression, anxiety disorders, and substance abuse problems. But there was no mental health support, no understanding of psychological trauma, no socially acceptable way to acknowledge that the work was destroying you emotionally. You were supposed to be a pillar of strength and wisdom, someone who could face death and suffering with philosophical equanimity. Showing weakness or vulnerability would undermine your professional authority and potentially end your career. So you suffered in silence while projecting an image of calm competence, knowing that your next patient might be the one whose death finally breaks your spirit or destroys your reputation. Every day was a psychological endurance test that you had to pass while appearing completely unburdened by the pressure. The financial pressures added another layer of stress to an already impossible situation. Roman doctors operated in a competitive marketplace where your income depended entirely on your ability to attract and retain patients. But your ability to actually help those patients was severely limited by the state of medical knowledge. This created a fundamental conflict between your economic interests and your patient's welfare. You needed to project confidence and promise results in order to build your practice. But honest assessment of most conditions would reveal that you had little to offer beyond sympathy and false hope. So you learned to manage expectations carefully, making just enough promises to keep patients engaged without setting yourself up for obvious failure. You developed elaborate explanations for why treatments might not work immediately, creating escape routes for when your interventions inevitably failed. The really successful Roman doctors weren't necessarily the most skilled healers. They were the most skilled salespeople, able to convince patients that complex, expensive treatments were necessary and that any failures were due to factors beyond the doctor's control. This created a perverse incentive system where medical practice became increasingly focused on revenue generation rather than patient care. Doctors were rewarded for performing more procedures, prescribing more medicines, and treating more patients, regardless of whether those interventions actually helped anyone. The pressure to maintain a steady income also meant that you couldn't afford to be too selective about which cases you accepted. You had to treat patients you knew you couldn't help, take on procedures you weren't qualified to perform, and make promises you couldn't keep. This economic desperation led many doctors to engage in practices that they probably knew were questionable, prescribing expensive treatments for minor conditions, performing unnecessary procedures to justify higher fees, claiming expertise in areas where they had little knowledge or experience. The guilt and shame associated with these ethical compromises must have been crushing, but the alternative was financial ruin and professional failure. Roman doctors were trapped in a system that forced them to choose between honesty and survival. And throughout all of this, you had to maintain the appearance of prosperity and success, because patients didn't want to be treated by doctors who looked desperate or unsuccessful. You had to dress well, live in a respectable neighborhood, and project an image of thriving practice even when you were struggling financially. This meant that many Roman doctors were living beyond their means, using credit to maintain appearances while hoping that their next big case would solve their financial problems. The stress of this precarious economic situation added yet another burden to an already overwhelming professional life. The really tragic part is that some Roman doctors probably could have made genuine contributions to medical knowledge if they'd been working in a different system. But the social, economic, and political pressures of their era made it virtually impossible for even talented physicians to practice effective medicine. They were trapped in a world that demanded certainty where none existed, confidence where humility would have been more appropriate, and results that were impossible to achieve with available knowledge and tools. The wonder isn't that Roman medicine was so ineffective, but that anyone was willing to practice it at all under such impossible conditions. And yet they persisted, day after day, patient after patient, crisis after crisis, because someone had to try. Even when they knew their efforts were largely futile, even when they were exhausted and discouraged and overwhelmed by the magnitude of human suffering they encountered, they kept showing up. That persistence in the face of impossible odds might be the most admirable thing about Roman doctors. They were fighting a war they couldn't win, using weapons they knew were inadequate against enemies they didn't understand. But they fought anyway because giving up would have meant abandoning sick people to suffer alone. Roman doctors were heroes of a sort, not because they were particularly successful at healing people, but because they were willing to dedicate their lives to an impossible task. They accepted responsibility for outcomes they couldn't control, made promises they couldn't keep, and carried burdens that would have crushed most people. They lived and worked in the space between what people needed and what was actually possible, trying to bridge a gap that couldn't be bridged with the knowledge and tools available to them. It was a thankless, impossible, often tragic calling that they pursued anyway because someone had to try. But perhaps the most soul-crushing aspect of being a Roman doctor wasn't the individual failures or the impossible cases. It was the gradual realization that the entire system you'd devoted your life to was fundamentally broken, and there was absolutely nothing you could do about it. See, Roman medicine wasn't just ineffective, it was systematically designed to remain ineffective. The whole structure of medical education, professional advancement, and social acceptance was built around preserving ignorance rather than advancing knowledge. And as a practicing physician, you were both a victim of this system and complicit in perpetuating it. Let me explain what I mean. Roman medical theory was based on the writings of ancient authorities like Hippocrates and Galen. These weren't just reference texts, they were sacred doctrines that couldn't be questioned without committing professional heresy. If Galen said that the liver produced blood, then the liver produced blood, regardless of what your own observations might suggest. Now imagine you're performing surgery and you notice something that contradicts established medical theory. Maybe you see that blood flows in a different pattern than the textbooks describe. Maybe you observe that a particular treatment consistently makes patients worse rather than better. Maybe you discover that certain anatomical structures don't match the ancient descriptions. What do you do with this information? You can't publish your findings because there are no medical journals. You can't share your observations with colleagues because that would be admitting that the ancient authorities were wrong, which would mark you as an arrogant fool. You can't modify your treatments based on evidence because patients expect you to follow established protocols. So you keep quiet, you file away your observations, and continue practicing medicine according to theories you know are incorrect. You watch patients suffer from treatments you suspect are harmful, but you administer them anyway because that's what Roman medical doctrine demands. This intellectual dishonesty was professionally necessary, but personally devastating. Every day you had to choose between scientific integrity and career survival. And since career survival was literally a matter of life and death in Roman society, most doctors chose to suppress their doubts and conform to established practices. But the psychological cost of this conformity was enormous. You weren't just failing your patients. You were failing yourself, abandoning your intellectual curiosity and critical thinking in favor of blind adherence to authority. You were becoming complicit in a system that valued tradition over truth. And the really insidious part was that this compromise happened gradually. You didn't wake up one morning and decide to abandon scientific principles. Instead, you made small concessions to professional necessity, each one seemingly reasonable in isolation until you'd completely surrendered your intellectual independence. First, you stopped questioning treatments that didn't seem to work. Then you stopped noticing when treatments didn't work. Eventually, you stopped caring whether treatments worked as long as they were socially acceptable and professionally safe. This gradual erosion of scientific integrity created a medical culture that was actively hostile to progress. Doctors weren't just ignorant, they were willfully ignorant, trained to avoid observations that might challenge established doctrine. The few physicians who tried to maintain some semblance of scientific curiosity found themselves increasingly isolated and professionally vulnerable. They were seen as troublemakers, rebels, dangerous radicals who threatened the stability of the medical establishment. But let's get even more specific about what your daily routine looked like, because the devil really was in the details. You wake up before dawn, not because you're an early riser, but because you know that sick people don't follow normal schedules. Someone always needs help at an inconvenient time. Your first task of the day is checking on patients you treated yesterday. This means walking through neighborhoods that range from merely dangerous to absolutely lethal, carrying medical supplies that mark you as a target for robbery. You're hoping that the people you treated are still alive, but you're also dreading what you might find. Patient number 1 is a construction worker who fell from scaffolding 3 days ago. You set his broken leg using wooden splints and linen bandages, the same technique that's been used for centuries despite its obvious limitations. When you arrive, you can immediately smell the infection. The wound is red, swollen, and beginning to ooze pus. In our world, this would be a simple matter of antibiotics and proper wound care. In ancient Rome, this man is probably going to lose his leg if he's lucky. If he's unlucky, the infection will spread to his bloodstream and kill him within days. And there's absolutely nothing you can do to prevent it, but you can't tell him that. You can't say, "I'm sorry, but you're probably going to die," because we live in an era before germ theory and antibiotics. Instead, you have to project confidence while applying treatments you know are useless. You clean the wound with wine, which might help slightly but probably won't. You apply herbal poultices that smell impressive but have no real medicinal value. You prescribe bed rest and a special diet that won't address the underlying infection. And while you're doing all of this, the patient's family is watching your every move, looking for signs of competence or incompetence. They're asking questions you can't answer honestly. Will he walk again? How long will it take to heal? Are you sure you know what you're doing? You give them false reassurance because that's what they need to hear and what your professional survival requires. You tell them that healing takes time, that the gods will determine the outcome, that following your instructions carefully will give him the best chance of recovery. All technically true, but fundamentally misleading. Patient number 2 is a wealthy merchant's wife who's been suffering from what we'd recognize as severe depression. She can't sleep, won't eat, and spends most of her time weeping inconsolably. Her husband is convinced that she's been cursed by an enemy or possessed by an evil spirit. Roman medicine had no concept of mental illness as we understand it. Psychological problems were either moral failings, divine punishments, or supernatural afflictions. Your treatment options are prayer, exorcism, or trying to rebalance her humors through bloodletting and purging. None of these approaches will help her depression, and some might make it worse. But you can't suggest that her problems might be psychological in nature because that would imply that her suffering isn't real or important. You can't recommend anything resembling modern therapy because the concept doesn't exist. So you prescribe a combination of herbal remedies, dietary changes, and religious rituals. You tell her husband that recovery will require patience and faith. You collect your fee and move on to the next case, knowing that you've accomplished nothing except maintaining the appearance of medical intervention. Patient number 3 is a teenage boy who's been having seizures. His parents are terrified that he's been possessed by demons or struck down by the gods for some unknown transgression. They want you to cure him immediately, and they're prepared to blame you if you fail. Epilepsy was completely misunderstood in ancient Rome. It was often called the sacred disease because people believed it was caused by divine intervention. Treatment involved a combination of religious rituals, dietary restrictions, and sometimes trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to release evil spirits. You know that these treatments won't cure epilepsy, but you also know that admitting ignorance would destroy your reputation. So you perform the expected rituals, prescribe the traditional remedies, and hope that the boy's seizures might spontaneously improve. But here's the really cruel part. Sometimes epilepsy does improve on its own, especially in young people. If this boy's seizures happen to decrease in frequency, you'll get credit for a miraculous cure. If they continue or worsen, you'll be blamed for incompetence or insufficient piety. Your professional reputation is being determined by random chance rather than actual medical skill. You're playing a lottery where the stakes are human lives and your career depends on outcomes you can't control. By the time you finish your morning rounds, you're already exhausted, both physically and emotionally. You've watched 3 people suffer from conditions you can't treat, lied to 3 families about their loved ones' prospects, and collected fees for services you know are essentially worthless. But your day is just beginning, because now comes the really challenging part: dealing with new patients who have expectations you can't meet and problems you can't solve. Your afternoon schedule includes a pregnant woman having complications, a gladiator with infected wounds from his last fight, and a senator's elderly father who's showing signs of what we'd recognize as dementia. Each case is a potential disaster that could end your career if you handle it wrong. The pregnant woman is having her first child at age 14, which was considered normal in Roman society, but resulted in much higher rates of maternal and infant mortality. She's been in labor for over a day, and the baby still hasn't emerged. In our world, this would be an emergency cesarean section. In ancient Rome, it's probably a death sentence for mother, child, or both. Your options are extremely limited, and all of them are dangerous. You can try to turn the baby manually, which might work, but could also cause internal injuries that would be fatal. You can attempt to deliver the baby in pieces, which might save the mother's life but guarantees the infant's death. Or you can just wait and hope that nature takes its course, knowing that time is running out for both patients. None of these options are good, but you have to choose one, and whatever you choose, you'll have to live with the consequences. If the mother dies, her family will blame you for not doing enough. If the baby dies, you'll be accused of incompetence or malice. If they both die, your reputation might never recover. But you can't refuse the case because that would make you look cowardly. You can't refer her to another doctor because that would suggest you're not qualified. You have to proceed with confidence while knowing that you're probably about to watch 2 people die. The gladiator presents a different set of challenges. His wounds are severe but not immediately life-threatening. However, he's expected to fight again in a few days, and his owner wants him patched up as quickly as possible. This creates a conflict between proper medical care and economic pressure. Ideally, the gladiator should rest for weeks while his wounds heal completely. But that would cost his owner money and potentially anger the crowds who want to see him fight. So you're expected to get him back in the arena as soon as possible, regardless of the medical risks. You know that rushing his recovery could lead to complications that might kill him. But you also know that refusing to clear him for combat could result in your dismissal from the gladiatorial medical staff, which would be a significant loss of income and prestige, so you compromise your medical judgment in favor of economic necessity. You declare him fit for combat knowing that he's not fully healed. You prescribe pain-numbing drugs that will mask his symptoms without actually addressing his injuries. You become complicit in a system that treats human beings as disposable entertainment. The senator's father presents yet another impossible situation. He's clearly suffering from some form of cognitive decline, but his family refuses to acknowledge that anything is seriously wrong. They want you to find a cure for what they insist is just temporary confusion brought on by stress or poor diet. Dementia was not understood in ancient Rome. Age-related cognitive decline was often attributed to moral weakness, divine punishment, or imbalances in the humors. Families were ashamed of relatives who showed signs of mental deterioration and desperate to find treatments that would restore their dignity. You know there's no cure for whatever is affecting this man's mind, But you can't tell his family that their patriarch is suffering from an incurable condition that will only get worse. They wouldn't accept that diagnosis, and it would destroy their hope while accomplishing nothing positive. So you prescribe treatments you know won't work. Herbal remedies for clearing the mind, dietary changes to strengthen the brain, bloodletting to rebalance the humors. You take their money while giving them false hope because that's what the system demands. Each of these cases represents a moral compromise that chips away at your integrity and peace of mind. You're not just failing as a healer. You're failing as a human being, forced to lie, deceive, and exploit people who trust you with their lives. And this pattern repeats itself every single day. New patients with impossible problems. New families with unrealistic expectations. New opportunities to choose between honesty and survival, between medical ethics and professional necessity. The psychological toll of these daily compromises was cumulative. Each lie you told made the next one easier. Each false hope you offered made genuine optimism harder to maintain. Each patient you failed to help made you more cynical about your ability to help anyone. Over time, many Roman doctors probably developed a kind of emotional numbness that protected them from the pain of constant failure. They learned to disconnect from their patients' suffering, to view medical practice as a business transaction rather than a healing relationship. This emotional detachment was probably necessary for psychological survival, but it also made them less effective healers. Patients could sense when their doctors didn't really care about their welfare, and this undermined the therapeutic relationship that might have provided some comfort even when medical treatment was ineffective. The social dynamics were equally corrosive. Roman doctors existed in a weird middle space where they were simultaneously respected and despised, needed and resented, trusted and suspected. Patients wanted them to be miracle workers, but treated them like servants. Society valued their services, but questioned their motives. This ambiguous social status created constant anxiety about professional standing and social acceptance. You never knew whether a patient saw you as a learned healer or a glorified snake oil salesman. You never knew whether your success would be attributed to skill or luck, whether your failures would be forgiven or remembered. The uncertainty was psychologically exhausting. You had to constantly read social cues, manage relationships, and navigate political undercurrents that had nothing to do with medicine, but everything to do with your survival as a professional. And then there were the truly horrific cases that would haunt any doctor's dreams. The children who died from diseases that could have been easily prevented. The women who bled to death in childbirth while their families watched helplessly. The soldiers who suffered agonizing deaths from infected wounds that turned gangrenous. These tragedies weren't occasional occurrences. They were routine parts of Roman medical practice. Death was so common that doctors had to develop emotional defenses against the constant exposure to human suffering, or they'd go insane from grief and guilt. But those emotional defenses came at a cost. The psychological walls that protected doctors from traumatic experiences also isolated them from genuine human connection. They became observers of suffering rather than participants in healing relationships. Many Roman doctors probably suffered from what we now recognize as chronic PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorders. But there was no mental health support, no understanding of psychological trauma, no socially acceptable way to acknowledge that the work was destroying them emotionally. They were expected to maintain stoic composure in the face of unimaginable horrors. Any sign of emotional vulnerability would undermine their professional authority and potentially end their careers. So they suffered in silence while projecting an image of unshakable competence. The isolation was profound. You couldn't discuss your doubts with colleagues because that would be admitting incompetence. You couldn't share your failures with patients because that would destroy their confidence. You couldn't confide in friends and family because they wouldn't understand the unique pressures of medical practice. You lived in a world where everyone expected you to have answers you didn't possess, solutions you couldn't provide, and confidence you couldn't honestly feel. The psychological strain of maintaining this facade while watching people suffer and die must have been enormous. And perhaps most tragically, the few doctors who might have had the intellectual capacity and emotional resilience to advance medical knowledge were crushed by a system that rewarded conformity and punished innovation. The brightest minds of their generation were forced to waste their talents on ineffective treatments and meaningless rituals. Imagine what Roman medicine might have achieved if doctors had been free to question established doctrine, experiment with new treatments, and share their observations without fear of professional retaliation. Imagine how many lives might have been saved if the medical establishment had valued evidence over authority. But that's not the world Roman doctors lived in. They were trapped in a system that systematically suppressed the very qualities that might have made them effective healers: curiosity, skepticism, intellectual honesty, and willingness to admit uncertainty. The really tragic irony is that some Roman doctors probably were genuinely brilliant individuals who could have made significant contributions to medical science under different circumstances. But the social, economic, and political constraints of their era made it virtually impossible for even the most talented physicians to practice effective medicine. They were heroes fighting an impossible war with inadequate weapons against enemies they couldn't see or understand. They persisted not because they were successful, but because someone had to try. They dedicated their lives to a calling that demanded everything and gave back very little except the knowledge that they had done their best in impossible circumstances. Roman doctors were casualties of their own dedication, victims of a system that consumed their idealism, their health, and their sanity in service of a medical practice that was fundamentally doomed to fail. They deserved better than the world they lived in, but they served that world anyway, because that's what healers do. And in a strange way, their failures were more noble than many modern successes. They faced impossible odds with inadequate tools and still showed up day after day, patient after patient, crisis after crisis. They carried burdens that would crush most people and continued practicing medicine even when they knew it was largely futile. That kind of dedication in the face of certain failure is perhaps the most admirable quality of Roman physicians. They weren't great doctors by modern standards, but they were extraordinary human beings who chose to dedicate their lives to helping others even when that help was largely symbolic. Their legacy isn't in the treatments they developed or the lives they saved. It's in their example of persistence, compassion, and professional dedication under circumstances that would have broken lesser people. They showed us what it means to practice medicine when medicine itself is broken, and they did it with a dignity that transcends their technical limitations. But let's be honest about what that dedication cost them personally. Because the price of being a Roman doctor wasn't just professional frustration or financial uncertainty. It was the slow destruction of everything that made life worth living. Your relationships suffered because you were constantly on call and emotionally drained. Your health suffered because you were exposed to diseases you couldn't treat and stress you couldn't manage. Your sense of purpose suffered because you knew your work was largely meaningless. You aged prematurely from the constant pressure and chronic sleep deprivation. You developed drinking problems to cope with the psychological trauma. You became cynical and detached to protect yourself from the pain of constant failure. Many Roman doctors probably died young, not from the diseases they treated, but from the stress of treating them. They sacrificed their own well-being in service of patients they couldn't really help, and society barely noticed their sacrifice. They were the forgotten casualties of an era that demanded more from its healers than it was willing or able to give them in return. They deserve to be remembered not for their medical achievements, which were limited, but for their human achievements, which were extraordinary. Roman doctors showed us what it means to persist in the face of impossible odds, to maintain compassion in the midst of constant tragedy, and to dedicate your life to helping others even when that help is largely symbolic. They were heroes of endurance rather than achievement, and their heroism was all the more remarkable for being largely unrecognized. In our modern world of advanced medicine and successful treatments, it's easy to forget that healing has always been as much about presence as it is about procedure, as much about compassion as it is about cure. Roman doctors embodied that truth in its purest form, offering comfort and hope when they couldn't offer healing. They remind us that being a healer isn't ultimately about having all the answers or performing miraculous cures. It's about showing up when people need you, even when you can't fix what's wrong with them. It's about bearing witness to human suffering and offering whatever comfort you can provide. That's a lesson worth remembering, even in our age of medical miracles. Because for all our technological advances, we still face diseases we can't cure, patients we can't save, and suffering we can't eliminate. And in those moments, we need the same qualities that sustained Roman doctors: persistence, compassion, and the willingness to help even when we can't heal. Roman medicine may have been primitive and largely ineffective, but the doctors who practiced it weren't primitive at all. They were complex, dedicated, often brilliant individuals who chose to spend their lives fighting battles they knew they couldn't win. And in making that choice, they showed us something profound about what it means to be human in the face of suffering. They may not have saved many lives, but they saved something equally important: the idea that healing is a noble calling worth pursuing even when success is unlikely. They kept that flame alive through the darkest period of medical history, and they passed it on to future generations who would eventually develop the tools and knowledge to make good on their promises. In the end, that might be the most important contribution Roman doctors made to the history of medicine. Not any particular discovery or technique, but the preservation of the healing tradition itself through an era when it had every reason to disappear. They maintained the faith that medicine mattered even when medicine didn't work. They kept the dream of healing alive even when healing seemed impossible, and they did it at enormous personal cost, sacrificing their own happiness and well-being for the sake of an ideal they might never see realized. That's not just admirable, that's heroic, and it's a heroism that deserves to be remembered and honored, even as we're grateful to live in an era when medicine has finally developed the power to fulfill the promises those ancient doctors made with such tragic sincerity. Roman doctors were the guardians of a dream that wouldn't become reality for another 1,000 years. They kept that dream alive through sheer force of will and dedication, passing it on to each new generation of healers who would inch closer to making it real. We haven't even talked about the religious complications yet. And oh boy, were there religious complications. See, in ancient Rome, medicine wasn't just a science, it was a theological minefield. Every diagnosis you made, every treatment you prescribed, every patient you lost, had potential religious implications that could get you in serious trouble with both the authorities and the gods themselves. Roman religion was incredibly complex, with dozens of different deities responsible for different aspects of health and healing. You had Asclepius, the primary god of medicine, but also Apollo for plague prevention, Diana for childbirth, Phoebus for fevers, and countless other specialized divine beings who might take offense if you didn't honor them properly. Before treating any patient, you were expected to perform the appropriate religious rituals: sacrifices, prayers, offerings, consultations with augurs, who read omens in bird flights or animal entrails. This wasn't just superstition, it was legal and social requirement. Skipping the religious protocols could get you accused of impiety, which was a capital offense. But here's where it gets really twisted. The religious requirements often directly contradicted sound medical practice. Let's say you have a patient who's bleeding heavily from a wound. Medical logic says you should stop the bleeding immediately, but religious protocol might require you to first perform a lengthy sacrifice to determine which god was responsible for the injury and what offerings would be appropriate. So you're standing there watching someone bleed to death while a priest slowly examines sheep's livers looking for divine messages. You know that every second counts, but you can't act without religious approval because that would be seen as arrogant defiance of the gods. And if the patient dies while you're waiting for religious clearance, guess who gets blamed? Not the priest who took too long with the ritual, you for failing to save them despite having divine guidance. The gods were also incredibly petty and vindictive, according to Roman theology. If you successfully treated someone who the gods wanted to punish, you might be interfering with divine justice. If you failed to save someone who the gods favored, you might be demonstrating insufficient piety or skill. There was no way to win this game. Every medical decision was potentially a religious transgression that could anger powerful deities who were known for taking terrible revenge on mortals who displeased them. Foreign doctors faced even worse religious scrutiny. If you were from Greece, Egypt, Syria, or anywhere else in the empire, your medical techniques were automatically suspect because they might involve foreign gods or forbidden magical practices. Roman authorities were paranoid about foreign influences corrupting traditional Roman values. If your treatment seemed too exotic or effective, you might be accused of practicing harmful magic or worshiping dangerous foreign deities. But if your treatments were too similar to Roman methods, you might be accused of being a fraud who was just copying local techniques without adding any real value. There was a narrow band of acceptable foreignness that was almost impossible to navigate successfully. And then there were the mystery cults, secret religious societies that promised special healing knowledge to their initiates. These cults were incredibly popular among both doctors and patients, but they were also illegal and subject to periodic government crackdowns. If you were known to be involved with mystery cults, it could enhance your reputation as someone with access to secret healing wisdom, but it could also get you arrested, tortured, and executed if the political winds shifted against foreign religions. The most successful Roman doctors learned to hedge their bets by publicly supporting traditional Roman religion, while privately maintaining connections to whatever healing traditions actually seemed to work. But this required constant deception, and the risk of exposure was always present. Patient families often had their own religious theories about what was causing illness and what treatments would be appropriate. They might demand that you honor their family's patron deities, perform specific rituals they'd inherited from their ancestors, or avoid treatments that conflicted with their personal religious beliefs. These demands had nothing to do with medical effectiveness and everything to do with theological politics, but refusing to accommodate them would offend the family and potentially create powerful enemies. So you found yourself performing elaborate religious theater alongside your medical procedures, chanting prayers while setting bones, making offerings while mixing medicines, consulting astrologers while diagnosing symptoms. This religious pageantry took enormous amounts of time and energy that could have been better spent on actual medical care, but it was absolutely necessary for maintaining social credibility and avoiding accusations of impiety. The psychological toll of this constant religious performance was devastating. You were forced to publicly support beliefs you might privately doubt while pretending that divine intervention was more important than medical knowledge. Many Roman doctors probably developed a kind of spiritual schizophrenia, maintaining elaborate facade of religious devotion while secretly relying on whatever practical medical knowledge they'd acquired through experience. But you could never admit this conflict because questioning religious authority was even more dangerous than questioning medical authority. At least incompetent doctors were only professionally ruined. Heretical doctors were burned alive. The seasonal religious calendar added another layer of complexity to medical practice. Certain times of year were considered unlucky for medical procedures. Specific days were reserved for honoring particular gods who might take offense if you were performing surgery instead of making sacrifices. During major religious festivals, all medical practice was supposed to stop while the entire city participated in collective worship. But diseases don't take religious holidays, and people still got injured during festivals. So you were caught between medical necessity and religious obligation, forced to choose between letting people suffer and risking accusations of sacrilege. Either choice could destroy your career, but only one might also damn your soul. The dream interpretation industry added yet another complication. Romans believed that gods communicated with mortals through dreams, and many patients would insist that their dreams contained important medical information. You might spend hours listening to elaborate dream narratives that patients believed held the key to their diagnosis or treatment. A patient dreams about a white horse, so obviously their illness is connected to Neptune. They dream about fire, so clearly they need cooling treatments. These dream interpretations had no medical value whatsoever, but dismissing them would be seen as rejecting divine guidance. So you had to pretend that random dream imagery was meaningful medical data while trying to provide actual health care. The oracle consultation business was equally problematic. Wealthy patients often insisted on consulting oracles before accepting medical treatment, and these consultations could override your professional judgment completely. An oracle might declare that a patient's illness was punishment for ancestral sins that could only be cured through expensive religious ceremonies. Or they might announce that the gods had already decided the patient's fate and that medical intervention was pointless. These pronouncements carried enormous social weight and could completely undermine your authority as a physician. Patients would often follow oracle advice instead of medical advice, even when it was obviously harmful. But you couldn't criticize the oracles without being accused of challenging divine authority. So you had to watch patients make terrible medical decisions based on religious nonsense while maintaining a respectful silence. The astrology obsession was another source of constant frustration. Roman medicine was deeply influenced by astrological theories that connected human health to the movements of celestial bodies. Different parts of the body were supposedly ruled by different planets and constellations. The timing of medical procedures had to be coordinated with favorable astrological conditions. Patient personalities and disease susceptibilities were determined by their birth charts. None of this had any basis in medical reality, but it was considered essential knowledge for any serious physician. You had to learn elaborate astrological calculations and timing systems that had nothing to do with healing, but everything to do with professional credibility. Patients would often refuse treatment if the astrological conditions weren't favorable, even in emergency situations. You might have someone bleeding to death in front of you while an astrologer consulted star charts to determine whether Venus was in the right position for surgery. The supernatural healing competition was fierce and well-funded. Temple healers, miracle workers, and divine healers offered alternative treatments that promised supernatural results through direct divine intervention. These competitors didn't need medical knowledge because they claimed to be conduits for divine power. They could make promises you couldn't make and guarantee results you couldn't guarantee because they weren't bound by physical reality. When temple healing worked, which it occasionally did through placebo effects or random chance, it was attributed to divine favor. When it failed, it was blamed on the patient's insufficient faith or hidden sins. This created an impossible competitive environment where you were trying to provide rational medical care while competing against people who claimed to have supernatural powers. Your evidence-based approach couldn't compete with their miracle marketing. The curse and evil eye paranoia added another layer of medical complexity. Many illnesses were attributed to magical attacks by enemies who had cursed the patient or given them the evil eye. These supposed magical attacks required magical defenses, not medical treatment. Patients might demand protective amulets, counter curses, or elaborate purification rituals, instead of or in addition to conventional medical care. You had to take these concerns seriously because dismissing them would insult the patient's beliefs and potentially lose their business. But addressing them required you to engage with magical practices that might conflict with your medical training. The demon possession diagnoses were particularly challenging. Mental illness, epilepsy, and various neurological conditions were often attributed to demonic possession that required exorcism rather than medical treatment. Families would bring possessed patients to you expecting medical confirmation of the supernatural diagnosis. If you suggested that the problem might be medical rather than demonic, you'd be accused of failing to recognize obvious spiritual warfare. But if you agreed that the patient was possessed, you'd be expected to either perform an exorcism yourself or refer them to religious specialists. Either choice would undermine your credibility as a medical professional. The magical medicine market was huge and largely unregulated. Anyone could claim to be selling enchanted healing potions, blessed herbs, or magically charged medical devices. These magical remedies competed directly with conventional medicines, but promised supernatural effects that regular drugs couldn't match. Patients often preferred magical treatments because they offered hope for miraculous cures. As a conventional doctor, you were stuck selling realistic treatments that admitted their limitations while competing against magical salespeople who promised impossible results with complete confidence. The religious hierarchy also controlled medical licensing and professional recognition. To practice medicine legally in many parts of the empire, you needed approval from religious authorities who evaluated your piety as much as your medical knowledge. These religious gatekeepers could revoke your license if they decided you weren't sufficiently devout, or if your medical practices conflicted with approved theological doctrines. So your career depended not just on medical competence, but on maintaining good relationships with priests, augurs, and other religious officials who might not understand medicine but had the power to destroy your livelihood. The divine punishment theory of disease created enormous guilt and shame for patients and their families. If illness was seen as divine retribution for moral failings, then being sick was evidence of being a bad person. This theological framework made patients reluctant to seek medical help because doing so might be seen as trying to escape deserved punishment. They might also be reluctant to recover because that might anger the gods who were trying to teach them a lesson. You had to navigate these complex theological anxieties while trying to provide medical care to people who might believe they didn't deserve to get better. The ritual purity requirements added practical complications to medical practice. Certain medical procedures were considered spiritually contaminating and required elaborate purification rituals afterward. Touching corpses, handling blood, or treating certain types of patients could make you ritually unclean and temporarily unfit to participate in religious ceremonies or treat other patients. These purity rules limited your ability to perform certain types of medical procedures and required you to schedule time for purification rituals that had nothing to do with hygiene, but everything to do with spiritual cleanliness. The seasonal religious obligations could completely disrupt your medical practice for weeks at a time. During major festivals, you were expected to participate in public ceremonies rather than treating patients. But diseases don't observe religious holidays, and medical emergencies continued to occur during festival periods. You had to choose between fulfilling your religious duties and meeting your medical responsibilities. Either choice could damage your reputation and professional standing, but the religious obligations usually took precedence because offending the gods was considered more dangerous than disappointing patients. The prophecy and omen interpretation business also interfered with medical practice. Unusual symptoms or disease patterns were often interpreted as divine omens that predicted future events or required special responses. A patient with an unusual rash might be seen as carrying a message from the gods about impending disasters. Someone with a rare condition might be viewed as a living omen that required interpretation by religious specialists. These supernatural interpretations could override medical diagnosis and treatment, turning your patients into religious curiosities rather than people who needed health care. The temple medicine competition was particularly frustrating because it offered genuine psychological benefits that conventional medicine couldn't match. Patients who visited healing temples often did feel better after participating in elaborate religious ceremonies. This improvement was probably due to placebo effects, stress reduction, and social support rather than divine intervention. But patients didn't care about the mechanism. They just knew that temple healing sometimes worked when conventional medicine failed. This created a situation where scientifically invalid treatments appeared to be more effective than medically sound ones, undermining public confidence in rational medical practice. The religious medical education system was completely separate from secular medical training. Future priests learned healing techniques that were based on theological principles rather than anatomical knowledge. These religiously trained healers competed directly with conventionally trained doctors, but operated according to completely different principles and standards. They didn't need to understand anatomy or disease mechanisms because they believed healing came from divine power rather than medical knowledge. This created two parallel medical systems that often contradicted each other and competed for the same patients. You might provide a medically sound diagnosis only to have a temple healer offer a completely different supernatural explanation. The sacred text interpretation requirements added another burden to medical education. Roman doctors were expected to be familiar with religious texts that contained healing information supposedly revealed by the gods. These texts were often contradictory, ambiguous, or completely irrelevant to practical medical problems, but questioning their accuracy or relevance was considered blasphemous. So you had to memorize elaborate theological medical theories that had no basis in observable reality while pretending they were valuable sources of healing wisdom. The divine inspiration claims were impossible to verify or refute. Some healers claimed to receive medical knowledge directly from gods through visions, dreams, or mystical experiences. These divinely inspired treatments couldn't be tested or evaluated using conventional medical standards because they supposedly operated through supernatural mechanisms that transcended physical laws. If divinely inspired treatments worked, it proved the healer's special connection to the gods. If they failed, it was because the patient lacked sufficient faith or the gods had other plans. This created an unfalsifiable medical system that couldn't be challenged through observation or evidence, making it impossible to distinguish between genuine healing knowledge and religious delusion. The martyrdom complex among some religious healers made rational medical discourse almost impossible. These healers viewed any criticism of their methods as persecution that proved their divine calling. They interpreted medical failures as tests of faith rather than evidence of ineffective treatment. They saw scientific skepticism as spiritual blindness rather than intellectual honesty. This martyrdom mentality made it impossible to have productive discussions about medical effectiveness because any negative feedback was reframed as religious persecution. The miracle cure marketing was relentless and professionally devastating. Religious healers could promise instant, complete cures through divine intervention, while conventional doctors had to admit that recovery would be slow, uncertain, and possibly incomplete. Patients naturally preferred miracle promises to realistic medical assessments, even when the miracles never materialized. The hope of supernatural healing was more appealing than the reality of gradual improvement through conventional treatment. This forced conventional doctors to either compete with miracle promises, which undermined their credibility, or accept that they'd lose patients to more optimistic competitors. The sacred calendar restrictions could delay critical medical care for days or weeks. Certain procedures were forbidden during religious observances, even in emergency situations. You might have a patient with a condition that required immediate surgical intervention, but if the religious calendar prohibited surgery during that period, you'd have to wait until the gods were supposedly more receptive to medical procedures. These delays could turn treatable conditions into fatal ones, but challenging the sacred calendar would be seen as attacking the foundation of Roman society. The divine will acceptance doctrine discouraged aggressive medical intervention because it might interfere with the gods' plans for individual patients. If the gods wanted someone to die, then trying to save them was presumptuous and possibly blasphemous. If the gods wanted someone to suffer, then relieving their pain might be thwarting divine justice. This theological framework made it difficult to justify intensive medical care for severely ill patients, because doing so might be seen as challenging divine authority. The religious medical licensing system favored candidates who demonstrated theological knowledge over medical competence. Understanding religious doctrine was often more important than understanding anatomy. This meant that the most medically qualified candidates might be rejected in favor of more religiously orthodox applicants, who knew less about healing but more about theology. The religious oversight of medical practice extended beyond licensing to ongoing supervision. Religious authorities could investigate doctors whose treatments seemed too effective or whose methods appeared to challenge approved theological explanations of disease. Successful doctors were sometimes accused of using forbidden magical techniques or making pacts with dangerous supernatural entities. Your medical success could be reinterpreted as evidence of spiritual corruption. The prayer prescription requirements added time and complexity to every medical encounter. Patients expected doctors to provide not just medical treatment, but also appropriate prayers for their specific conditions. You had to memorize dozens of different healing prayers and know which ones were appropriate for different diseases, patient demographics, and religious affiliations. These prayer prescriptions had no medical value, but were considered essential components of proper health care. Patients might refuse treatment if you couldn't provide the correct religious formulas. The holy relic integration into medical practice required you to incorporate blessed objects into your treatments, whether they made medical sense or not. Patients might insist on wearing specific amulets during surgery or having blessed stones placed on their wounds. These religious requirements could interfere with sterile technique and surgical access, but refusing them would offend the patient's beliefs. The seasonal god rotation meant that different deities were responsible for healing during different times of year. You had to adjust your religious practices and prayer selections according to which gods were currently ascendant. This religious calendar had nothing to do with disease patterns or medical effectiveness, but patients expected their health care to align with current theological priorities. The divine diagnosis confirmation system required religious authorities to approve your medical assessments before treatment could begin. A priest or augur had to confirm that your diagnosis was theologically acceptable. If religious authorities disagreed with your medical assessment, you'd have to either change your diagnosis or explain why the gods might have different opinions about the patient's condition. This theological oversight could delay treatment, contradict medical evidence, and force you to provide care based on religious doctrine rather than clinical judgment. The supernatural prognosis expectations meant that patients wanted you to predict not just medical outcomes, but also divine intentions regarding their illness. They expected you to know whether the gods planned to heal them, test them, or punish them through their disease. These supernatural predictions were impossible to make accurately, but essential for maintaining patient confidence. The religious competition evaluation system compared your results not just with other doctors, but with temple healers, miracle workers, and divine healing specialists. If religious competitors achieved better outcomes through supernatural means, it reflected poorly on your conventional medical approach, regardless of the scientific validity of their methods. This created impossible performance standards where you were expected to achieve results that matched or exceeded supernatural interventions using only natural medical techniques. The theological medical education requirements meant that a significant portion of your training time was devoted to religious studies rather than medical knowledge. You had to learn elaborate theological theories about disease causation, divine healing mechanisms, and proper religious protocols for medical practice. This religious education crowded out time that could have been spent learning anatomy, observing disease patterns, or developing practical healing skills. The sacred text medical interpretation demanded that you find medical wisdom in religious documents that were primarily concerned with theology rather than healthcare. These texts often contained contradictory or medically dangerous advice, but questioning their medical validity was considered blasphemous. You had to reconcile religious medical doctrine with observed medical reality, often by developing elaborate explanations for why divine wisdom appeared to contradict physical evidence. The divine punishment medical theory created a treatment paradox where curing someone might interfere with divine justice, while failing to cure them might demonstrate insufficient piety. This theological framework made it impossible to develop consistent treatment approaches because every medical decision had potential religious implications that could be interpreted as either virtuous or blasphemous. The religious medical hierarchy placed theological authorities above medical experts in healthcare decision-making, even when those authorities had no medical training or understanding. Priests could override your medical recommendations based on religious considerations that had nothing to do with patient welfare or clinical effectiveness. This inverted authority structure meant that medical expertise was subordinated to theological opinion, making it difficult to provide optimal patient care. The miracle expectation pressure forced you to either promise supernatural results you couldn't deliver or admit limitations that made you appear inferior to religious competitors. Patients wanted miracles, not gradual improvement through natural healing processes. They preferred impossible promises to realistic medical assessments. This created a medical marketplace where honesty was punished and deception was rewarded, undermining the entire foundation of trustworthy healthcare. And perhaps most tragically, this whole religious medical system prevented the development of effective treatments by attributing all healing to divine intervention rather than medical knowledge. When patients recovered, it was because the gods had decided to heal them. When they died, it was because the gods had other plans. Medical technique was irrelevant to these theological explanations. This religious framework made it impossible to learn from experience, improve treatment methods, or develop better medical practices, because all outcomes were attributed to supernatural causes rather than natural processes. Roman doctors weren't just fighting disease and injury, they were fighting an entire worldview that made medical progress virtually impossible by explaining everything through religious, rather than scientific principles. The psychological toll of practicing medicine within this religious framework must have been enormous. You were trying to help people using rational methods while operating within an irrational system that undermined everything you were trying to accomplish. Every day brought new reminders that your medical knowledge was considered less important than religious doctrine, that your healing efforts were seen as secondary to divine intervention, and that your professional expertise was subordinate to theological opinion. The wonder isn't that Roman medicine was so ineffective. The wonder is that any medical progress occurred at all within a system so completely hostile to scientific thinking and evidence-based practice. Roman doctors preserved the idea of rational medicine through one of the most irrational periods in human history. They maintained the belief that healing could be understood and improved through human effort rather than divine caprice. That preservation of scientific medical thinking, however limited and compromised, was perhaps their greatest contribution to the history of healing. They kept the flame of rational medicine alive through an era that could easily have extinguished it completely, but the personal cost of that preservation was devastating. Roman doctors sacrificed their intellectual integrity, their emotional well-being, and often their physical health to maintain medical traditions that wouldn't bear fruit for another 1,000 years. They were guardians of a dream they'd never see realized, protectors of knowledge they couldn't fully use, practitioners of healing arts that were constantly undermined by the religious and social systems they were forced to work within. Their story is ultimately one of tragic heroism. They chose to practice medicine knowing it was largely futile, maintain scientific principles knowing they'd be ignored, and dedicated their lives to healing knowing they'd be remembered more for their failures than their efforts.